Citywest Church. Welcome to our online message for this week. Hope you're having a great morning so far. Thanks so much for joining us online today. We're going to jump straight into God's Word this morning, and we are looking at our last week. It's the last Sunday of October, through a little series we've called Rhythm and Rest, finding the rest and the rhythm that's found in Scripture. This morning I want to talk to you about living in season. There's nothing like eating fruit that's in season, right? Obviously summer's coming soon. We'll start hitting into peaches, mangoes, all those kinds of things, and it's always great to have things that are in season. I just want to read to you from Psalm 1 just as we kick off, verse 1 to 3. It says this: "Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with mockers." Verse 2, "But they delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. They are like trees planted by a riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Their leaves never wither, and they prosper in all they do." I love this verse, this starting of the book of Psalms, and it kicks off with, don't do all these things, but delight in the law of the Lord. Think about it all the time. What does that mean? The law of the Lord is the Bible for us as New Testament believers. Let's delight in the Bible. Let's be people that meditate, think about God's word all the time. And then it says that we will bear fruit each season. So I want to talk to you this morning about in season. There's so many rhythms and of nature that are all around us. I don't know if you remember, I was thinking about this week. The very first time you swam in the ocean and the waves were big and you got dunked. Anyone ever been in that? If you think back to your teenage years, or maybe you're young and or maybe you've never swum in the ocean, and if you swim in the ocean one day, that day will come, I'm sure, where you underestimate, that's the word I'm looking for, sorry. You underestimate the waves, and you try and jump over a wave that you should jump under, and boom, it knocks you and you tumble around, and you get that feeling that, whoa, the ocean is massive and I am so small. Have you ever had that feeling, the power of the ocean kind of going straight over you? You realize that this is so much bigger than me, and you realize that you didn't make the waves, but the waves could end you, And I heard Rick Warren say recently that we don't make waves in life, but we do ride them. You can't make waves, like you can't go into the ocean and somehow control the waves. You have to ride them. You have to, there's a big difference between a surfer on elegantly surfing on a wave and someone getting dunked by a wave because they underestimate or they try and control the wave and make it what they want it to be. You have to go with the wave. And so this morning I'd love to talk about the idea of seasons and rhythm, and look starting with nature but ending with our spiritual walk. That's really what this message is about. That's how it's going to roll out and unpack. And in Genesis 8 verse 22 it says, "As long as the earth remains," this is after the flood, God talking to Noah, "as long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night." And we see that they are all those things that are mentioned there. They are creation rhythms, planting and harvesting, day and night, summer and winter. It's not just things that happen. It was part of creation. It was God's divine design for creating the world, was that it would be that rhythm, that we would have 4 seasons in a year. And in Psalm 74 verse 17, it kind of gives us that big look at God and what he did when he made the world. It says, "You set the boundaries of the earth and you made both summer and winter." So if you love summer, you need to remember that God made winter. And if you love winter, you got to remember that God made summer. He made them both, and they're both important seasons in the course of a year. And so naturally our world just moves in seasons, right? I think that in our modern world, especially live in Australia here, sometimes we kind of can forget about seasons in some ways because, well, the weather's crazy, or it's, you can, like last year on my summer holiday, it was supposed to be, it was the middle of January, one of the hottest times in Australia, and I was wearing track pants and a hoodie and freezing and not going in the water because it was too cold. And I think, in our modern world, Western world specifically as well, particularly, we don't really celebrate seasons the way that maybe our ancestors or even our grandparents would have celebrated seasons, because you can buy the same fruit all year round, but actually it's seasonal. And sometimes in our modern world, we have lost sight of the seasons. And when we lived in Japan, one of the things that we really loved about it was that they celebrated each season well. And there were certain things that you could only get in that season. And what it did is it made each season special. So they had obviously the fruits and vegetables that are in season for that season. So summer, winter, autumn, spring. They would have all those things in season, and you would eat it in that season, and then you wouldn't eat it again until next year. And it kind of made the seasons a bit more special, like you wouldn't go and buy, frozen stuff in different seasons. You would wait for the season and you would celebrate the season, much like the Hebrews did in the Old Testament. They really celebrated seasons around worshiping God and all those kinds of things. But you didn't come to have a grade 2, what do they call it when I was in school? HSIE, Human Society and Its Environment. I don't know what they call it these days. I'm not up with that. But you didn't come to learn about 4 seasons in a year today naturally. We want to talk about the things that are spiritual. But I wanted to start talking about the natural things, because I think it's important that we understand that the world that we live in and the way that it's set up is not just by chance, and it's not just it's actually everything spiritual, because God is part of everything. And as you look at nature and as you look at seasons, and as we as modern society have somehow over time lost sight of seasons, and we don't celebrate seasons as much as we used to, because we can get the same thing all year round, and it's put in cold storage or whatever they do, snap freeze. I don't know. I'm not that into the food distribution industry. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but we kind of have the same things available all year round, and that's good for convenience, but it's bad for recognizing seasons and how things can change. But I want to highlight the natural today before I jump into the spiritual side of seasons, because it's important that those images of natural seasons can really help us understand spiritual things. Because why? Because God made them all. And there's this verse in Romans chapter 1, or a few verses, in Romans chapter 1, where it talks about people trading to worship the creation instead of the creator. Let me read it to you. It's in Romans 1 verse 23. Romans 1 verse 19 to 23. It says, they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities. There's the image there that I'm trying to pull on today, that in natural things that you can see the image and what God's like. It says his eternal power and divine nature. It says, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Verse 21 says, yes, they know God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. Verse 23, it says this is the key part I wanted to highlight. Instead of worshipping the glorious, ever-living God, they worship idols made to look like mere people, birds, animals, and reptiles. So what that means is they did, instead of worshipping God who made it all, they worshipped the things that God created. And in doing so, it made them dark and confused, and they thought they were wise, but they were actually foolish. And that's a kind of a stinging assessment there. And but what the point I'm trying to make, and the picture that I'm trying to paint today, is that in nature there is lessons for us because God made it all, and we need to make sure that we don't worship seasons so much, but we worship the God of the seasons. That's naturally and spiritually. And so I want to kind of click over now into spiritual seasons and talk about that just for a few minutes. Natural seasons are not the ending point, but they actually give us a glimpse into Jesus and what God's like and how that applies to our lives spiritually. My first point today is this. It's, as a follower of Jesus, we have to be committed to a long obedience in the same direction. Eugene Peterson has a book titled that. It's stuck with me ever since I've read that book and seen that title, that following Jesus truly is a long obedience in the same direction. But the seasons will change. You'll have a winter season, you'll have a summer season, spiritually speaking, where things are great, where it's harvest time, where it's sowing time, where it's cold time, where it's hot time, where it's rest time, where it's work time. You would have all those seasons in your life spiritually. But the goal is not to live like this seasonally, but to have a long obedience in the same direction that in every season we are moving closer to a deeper relationship with Jesus. You know, Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 to 11, if you've been going to church for a little while, you've probably heard this. It says, for everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Verse 9 says, what do people really get for all their hard work? I have seen the burden God placed on us all, yet he has made everything beautiful in its own time. He's planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people can't see the whole scope of God's work beginning to end. And what does all that mean? It means that there's a time for everything under heaven, basically, that God has appointed times, and there's seasons in our life where it's a time for one thing and it's not a time for the other. And then in other times in our life, it will be a time for other things and not this thing. And it's important that we understand that we have been made with eternity in our hearts. So we have this knowledge that there's more to life than what we can see, that there's more than just what this world maybe has to offer. But at the same time, we don't know the whole scope of the things of God. You know, you don't know what was happening, you know, a millennia ago or in a millennia's time, but God does. And we have that sense that God will be in charge, was in charge, is now in charge, will be in charge into the future as well. But we don't know how all that's going to work. You don't know that, I don't know that, we don't know that. And even if you kind of bring that meta view of all of history down to just even your own life, you know, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, the next day, the day after, but we know that God's in control if we're believers, and that's the eternity in our hearts. But it's also that not knowing the full scope of who God is, because if you knew the full scope of God, guess what? You would be God, and you're not, and I'm not, and we're not, and we can't be, because God, we don't know everything, but God does. And so I want to encourage you that, you know, it says here, you know, there's a time, that for everything there is a season, it says, you know, in the Hebrew word, it means appointed time. Seasons are appointed times, like, so, you know, autumn is the appointed time for leaves to turn and go golden and fall off. You know, spring is the appointed time for new growth and flowers after the winter time. It's an appointed time. It's not just seasons, you know, like we loosely kind of use that word to kind of get out of things, but it's actually appointed time for different things. And one of my favorite theologians, he's Japanese, his name is Kosuke Koyama, and he says that in endurance, life is taken seriously. Trouble is not avoided, it is faced. It says in endurance, life is taken seriously. So what is he talking about? He's talking about when things get hard, don't give up. When you're in a tough season, don't give up on the things of God just because it's not going your way. You know, so many stories throughout the Bible, things don't go people's way. Things don't go the way that they planned, but they go the way God planned it. Even in my own life, you know, there's things that I thought I had a plan, and if it went according to my plan, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have went to Japan. I wouldn't have done some of the things that I've done throughout my life. And I'm sure you could tell a similar story where, you know, if you stuck to your plan, you wouldn't be where you are today. But by the grace of God, and because God has a great plan for each and every one of us, we are able to be where we are today by the grace of God, because we've said yes to his plan, even though it messed up our plan. And so a long obedience is not about running away when it's hard or blaming God when things are difficult. It's actually about staying close to God in every season. The second point I just want to highlight is you've got to know what season you're in spiritually. You can't just kind of hope for the best, and you can't look at someone else and go, well, I want to be in the same season as them, spiritually speaking, and try and be like that. What you'll end up doing is you'll end up hurting yourself and probably others as well. But what season are you in now? Are you in the summer where it's rest time? Are you, in the winter where it's maybe a bit dark and you feel, like not much is happening, but God is bubbling away under the surface. I don't know, what season are you in right now? Is it a time for you to sow or reap? Is it a time for you to receive or give? What season are you in? In Hosea 6 verse 3 it says this, "Oh, that we may know the Lord. Let us press on to know him. He will respond to us as surely as the arrival of dawn, of the coming of the rains in the early spring." It's this is a great verse pulling on our personal relationship with God and kind of the metaphors being the things of nature, like it always rains in spring, and the dawn comes every day. It's different every day, but it's also the same. It's constant, but it's changing. It's one of the beautiful pictures we have in nature of what God's like, constant, but constant. Our lives, God's not changing. Sorry, it's constant, which is the God part, but it's changing us. That's our part. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say. Anyway, in 1 Chronicles 12 verse 32, it says this. It talks about the tribe of Issachar. There were 200 leaders of the tribe with their relatives. It says, "All of these men understood the signs of the times, and they knew the best course of action for Israel to take." I love this verse because it's talking about men being aware of what's happening to them and their people and around them, but not just knowing what's happening, but knowing what to do. It says here, the best course of action for Israel to take. I want to encourage you with that. It's not good enough to just know the season you're in. You have to go deeper with God and say, God, what do I do in this season? How do I keep this long obedience in the same direction, chugging along, so to speak, in every season? So it's not enough to know that you're in this season. You've got to go to God and say, God, would you help me understand the signs of the times for my own life and the world around me? But also, can you help me, give me the best course for us to take in my own life, in my family, in our church, in our world, around and about us as we live our lives? You've got to know your season, and then you've got to respond accordingly. I've kind of already touched on this, but no one wears those big puffer jackets on a 40-degree day, right? Because they respond accordingly to the seasons. In the summer you wear shorts and a t-shirt. In the winter, do you really need those puffer jackets in Australia? Who knows? Maybe 1 or 2 days a year you need it. But anyway, you wear warm clothes in winter and cool clothes in summer, because what are you doing? You're responding to the season accordingly. And it's the same thing spiritually. So if it's in the, so we are to go deep in the winter, sow in the spring, rest in the summer, harvest in the autumn or fall. That's the kind of seasons where we find ourselves. We need to respond accordingly. When you're in the winter, it's time to go deep. It's not time to go out, it's time to go deep in the things of God. When you're in the spring, you've got to sow. It's time to sow, it's time to get up, it's time to move, it's time to do something, it's time to sow into other things. And then you rest in the summer and you harvest in the fall or the autumn. So knowing your season is good. Responding accordingly in this, knowing the season you're in, is even better. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. The last thing I want to say to you today is God is in every season. You might think, oh, in the winter is God with me? Yes, God's with you in the winter because he made winter. He knows what it's like. He knows what to expect. And it says this in Galatians 6 verse 7 to 10. It says, "Don't be misled. You can't mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live to satisfy their sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit." This is verse 9. So let's not get tired of doing what's good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Therefore, whenever we have the opportunity, we should do good to everyone, especially those in the family of faith. It's a great verse kind of talking about the natural seasons metaphor, but the spiritual application for our lives, that we would not be misled, that we would harvest what we plant, not just naturally in terms of putting things into the ground, but spiritually as we sow into the things of God, we are able to reap a harvest if we do what's right, if we sow the right things, if we understand the seasons and we sow at the right time and reap at the right time and rest at the right time and go deep in God at the right time. And so I want to encourage you with that today. So really this message is called In Season, but probably the main takeaway is a long obedience in the same direction, know your season and respond accordingly in Jesus' name. Let me pray. God, thank you so much for this time together. Lord, thank you for the natural picture of seasons that are so, each season is so beautiful in its own way. And Lord, also we just kind of acknowledge the spiritual seasons of life, Lord, and we just want to make sure that we live our lives on that long obedience in the same direction, but also at the same time, Lord, help us to know the seasons that we're in and help us to respond accordingly. Thank you that seasons don't last forever. And Lord, I pray that we will be like the sons or the men of Issachar, who understand the times, who know the times, and they responded accordingly with what was best. Lord, help us do